In this short video, I want to talk about the power of the clause for learning a foreign language. Knowing exactly what a clause is and how to recognize it in the language that you speak is first the critical so that you can take that knowledge and look for it and learn how to work with it in the foreign language. So a clause is always going to be a collection of words. It's going to be divided into two general parts, the subject and the predicate. Now, the word predicate literally means that which is discussed, or the saying about. If you look at the etymology or the word history of the word predicate, it's actually pretty helpful for you to remember that it's just the part of the clause that says something about the subject. So you have a subject and a predicate. Um, it's sometimes easy to say that the subject is the subject of the clause as it might be the subject of a conversation. You know what I'm saying? So but that's sort of misleading. Um, the best way to go about this is to realize from the beginning that there's a relationship of reciprocity between the subject and the predicate. In other words, the predicate defines the subject, and the subject defines the predicate, and that is not sort of not acceptable if you're going to go at this at a very logical way. That's circular reasoning, if you will. It doesn't make for a good definition at all. You can't define a term with language that uses the term you're trying to define. But what I'm getting at is your mind is created to be a language oriented mind. All right. So there are some things about this deep grammar that are just self evident to you. You might not realize that right now. At the end of these videos, I hope that that's one thing that you will at least consider, if not be convinced of. And it's kind of like math. There are basic observations or truths to math that are self-evident, and you can start with those very basic principles and move forward in your mathematical knowledge. But the beginning principles are basically self-evident. By that I mean that just looking at the relationship or the numbers and how they are working with each other, you automatically know the outcome of that operation. So there is a sense that that is what's happening with language. This is I believe this is why a 1 year old, a 1.5 year old, a 2 year old can really pick this thing up, and by the time well, depending on the mind and all of that, whatever, but very soon that infant becomes a toddler, and that toddler is talking and just is using the grammar. So there is a sense that you're going to be able to recognize clauses without necessarily knowing exactly how to describe the predicate and exactly how to describe the subject. I would say right up front, it's a good idea to get rid of a lot of simplistic ideas about this. For example, you might want to equate a subject with a noun. So you might, well, not you, but people that have a very superficial understanding of grammar might say, oh, subject predicate. Well, that's your noun and your verb, and that's tricky. To me, I'm like, okay, you're on thin ice, because it makes superficial sense. It makes sense, quickly on the surface, but it will then depend on how you define noun, right? And if you define a noun, I don't, but if you're one of the grammarians, or if you're of the group of people that define a noun as a person, place, or thing, you define a noun with its relationship with other words. For example, a noun can always take an adjective, an article of some sort. In English, we have three articles: the, a, and an. Now, a and an are basically the same, so you really have two articles. One is the definite article, the book. That means it's a very definite reference to the thing. Or the other article, the a, and the an, are indefinite articles, because if you say just grab a book, you're basically telling someone just pick one. It doesn't matter, right? So a noun can always take articles, and a noun can always be made plural. right? If not technically in the letter sense, by because sometimes you do run across some words in English that spell the same as singular and plural, but the point is a noun can take on a plural aspect, right? And I would be like, yeah, sure, but I would never say that all nouns are subjects and all subjects are nouns, right? So I have trouble with the whole thing as a subject being a noun, right? Um, Same thing as a verb, right? Because you might say, oh, subject predicate. Well, that means noun and a verb, and it's verb. Then I would ask, well, what is a verb, right? And then you might say, well, a verb is a state of being and an action word. But, that's tricky. That is tricky because take the word run, okay? RUN. Is that a noun or a verb? It does seem to be talking about action, but it just depends how you use it in a collection of other words, right? Because you can say, I run fast. So there it's a verb, right? You might say, I like to run. That's not technically a verb. That's what we call an infinitive. We may or may not get to that in these videos. But what about this? The run won the game. What if we're talking about baseball? Okay. And, that the ninth inning, that great run actually won the game. Now, that you notice that I shift meanings, right? But I'm allowed to do that because we were just talking about the word that's spelled RUN. We weren't talking about its meaning. It might have a range of meanings, and depending on those ranges, it might be depending on one of those meanings or the other, it might be a verb or it might be a noun, right? So how are you going to define a verb? I would much rather you start moving away from those parts of speech names and start going to this deeper language of subject and predicate, and let's let these things be basic. Let's we're definitely going to talk about nouns and verbs, but let's start thinking in terms of a language like the subject and the predicate. And as we progress further, we'll be hitting subject and predicate is not that unusual, but we will be hitting some terminology that is not used in most entry level grammar books for English or for some other languages. Okay, but these are the terms for this deeper language. Okay, and we're starting with subject and predicate, and those two together make the clause.